to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to show you some examples on blunders. And I have news for you. Even experienced players, masters, and even grandmasters make blunders time to time. Of course, they would do it less frequently than a player who is new to the game. But in this lesson, I'll share with you some painful moments for some of the grandmasters. Here we go. This is the first example, and this position was reached between super grandmasters Svidler and Grishchuk, both from Russia. Well, for their defense, I have to add that they have played this game in a tournament where both players play blindfolded. That is, they don't see the chessboard, but they call out the moves in an algebraic notation such as e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, and so on. And they vision the position in their heads. To some newcomers to the game, it may sound unbelievable and may say, no wonder they make a mistake. However, I have to add, while obviously it is more common, it's still very rare that a grandmaster of their level would make a simple mistake that they did. Well, White played a natural-looking move, moving the rook from the corner to the open file to c1. Well, in itself, that looks like a very natural and normal move because rooks indeed belong on open files, that is, where there are no pawns of your own color. However, I can't stress it enough that in chess, tactics always come ahead of strategy. It doesn't matter how nice your position may look strategically, if you end up losing your pieces, generally speaking, you'll end up losing the game, and your gain wasn't important. In this case, the problem is that by the white rook moving to c1, while there is no way to immediately capture that rook, it has imprisoned the other rook that's on d1. And black is able to attack that rook with the other bishop. As we know, bishops are of less value than rooks, only 3 points versus 5 for the rook. And if this bishop now gets to capture the rook, even if after that the white rook captures back on d1, it will be still a significant material gain for black. On the other hand, if the white rook would intend to run away, if you look carefully, you'll see that any square that that rook would intend to run to is covered by one of the black bishops. Let's move on to another example. Here we go. This game was played between Molchanova and Pia Krumling at the Women's European Championship earlier this year. If you look carefully, I'm sure you'll notice that the black knight, which has just moved to c5, is attacking the white queen. And generally speaking, when a major piece like a queen is being attacked, most of the time we cannot do anything but move that piece away from the attack. There can be exceptions when we may counterattack one way or another. For example, give a check, keeping our opponents busy reacting to that, which is not an option in this case. Or it may be counterattacking our opponent's queen, or sometimes creating a pin. And that's exactly what White tried to do in this game. White responded by retreating the bishop to e3, putting a pin on the black knight. So for example, if black continues and captures the queen anyway, then bishop takes the queen also, And white indeed would be in an excellent shape because this would have been then only an exchange of queens, and black's isolated pawn on d5 is under dual attack by white's rook from d1 as well as bishop on g2, giving white a very nice position. But let's get back to the beginning, where white has just played the bishop back to e3. What's the problem with this move? Well, here comes the problem. The problem is, if the black queen wouldn't be on an unprotected square, where it is right now, then the white queen would be lost for nothing. And black has an immediate way to gain material here by capturing the white knight on b5. So what happens now is, black so far won a knight, and if white responds with capturing the black queen, black will respond by capturing the white queen. And as a result, black will maintain his extra knight that he just captured. On the other hand, if white moves his queen away from the attack, for example to c2, the black queen can also safely move away without giving back the extra piece. What would happen, on the other hand, if the white bishop would capture on c5 the knight? Now, if the black bishop captures back, bishop takes c5, then the white queen no longer is attacked, but the black queen is. Well, here the catch is that the black queen can move away from the attack at the same time and capture the bishop also. Again, if you look carefully, you will see that black has an extra bishop. Going back to our starting position here, we can conclude that bishop e3 is a serious error. White should have moved the queen to a safe square. Let's move on. Follow up with the next position. This game is played by two very highly rated players also, by the Czech Grandmaster Navara versus Elyanov from the European Championship of 2009. In this position, white made a similar type of mistake as we have seen in our first example. White, just like in that game, moved his rook to c1. In this case, doubling up the rooks, putting further pressure on the pawn on c6. As we can see, now there are three white pieces, the two rooks, as well as the bishop on g2, all aiming at the pawn on c6. Indeed, if it was white's turn, white now could capture the pawn on c6 with the bishop and gain a pawn. Naturally, black could protect that pawn a third time with the rook on d6 if they would choose to, but that would certainly miss out on a much better opportunity. Black instead chose to trap the rook, just like in that first example that we saw. Right now, the white rook is being attacked. Obviously, if it captures the knight, that would be a loss of 2 points, because the black pawn from a5 would recapture. On the other hand, if the rook would move on the c file, whether to c3, when knight a2 would be the answer, forking the two rooks, or moving the rook rather to c5, then the response would be knight d3, and again the two rooks are both attacked at the same time, and this would result in material gain for black, winning an exchange more specifically. If we're going back to the starting position, we will see that white could have played differently here. For example, bringing the king to f1 and then to e2 and so on. Although black being a pawn up would have a better position anyway. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. This example has been played by today's superstar Magnus Carlsen although at the time of this game he was only 14 years old. However, already rated above 2500 rating, which is quite high, especially when you're 14. However, this shows you that even the best of the best make mistakes sometimes. In this case, it was poor Magnus's turn to make a mistake, and he has castled. I don't blame him wanting to get out of this annoying pin that forbids the Black Knight of moving. But it would have been better to, for example, retreat the queen to d6. Let's see what was the problem with castling, which is such a natural move, and generally I certainly do recommend to castle as soon as you can. But then again, remember the rule of thumb. All the strategical priorities are less important than the tactical opportunities that may result in losing a piece. And that's certainly the case here, where white can create a discovery by moving the bishop out of the rook's way, and now all of a sudden the black queen is attacked both by white's rook as well as bishop, and it's a hidden skewer at the same time, as the white bishop aims at the black knight on d7, and the white rook from d1 also aims at it after the queen moves away. The game ended real quick after queen takes pawn, queen takes, bishop takes, and bishop takes knight. At a professional level, an advantage of an extra knight generally results in the weaker side resigning the game. And in this case, Magnus Carlsen gave one more check and resigned. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, there is material balance at the moment. If we look at the pawn structure, we'll see that it's kind of unusual. White has two pawns on the c-file, which would be called doubled pawns, and the same is happening on the g-file. Generally speaking, double pawns are a disadvantage because the pawn that's behind is limited by its mobility by the pawn that's in the front. This situation is perhaps an exception from that, because the white pawns actually are pretty well positioned. For example, the pawns that we see on the king side of the board, the three pawns g4, f5, and g6, are all on light colored squares, while the black pawns on f6, g7, and h6 are on dark colored squares. Why is this important? Because we only have left the bishops that are running on dark squares. So therefore, the black pawns are potential targets for white's bishop, while white's pawns on the king side are not in any potential danger from black's bishop. In the meantime, the position, of course, is still rather complicated, and black could have, for example, continued by pushing the d pawn ahead, trying to exchange some pieces. Black instead made a serious mistake by moving the rook to e4. The problem of this move is that it leaves the other rook unprotected. But you may wonder who is attacking it. And indeed, nobody is attacking it at the moment. However, it created a potential pin situation. The black pawn on d5 now is restricted, more restricted in movement, and especially if it would move away from the d file, the rook on d8 would be in danger. With all that hint, hopefully you figured out the correct move for white right now, which is to temporarily sacrifice the queen for the black rook on e4. Pawn captures queen, and now rook captures rook. So far, white captured 2 rooks and gave up the queen. That's already a slight material gain. In addition, right now, the black king is in check. It needs to react to that. For example, king c7. And now the white rook can cash in a 3rd piece, another bishop. So now white got the rook, a 2nd rook, and the bishop. That's already a significant gain by giving up only a queen. This was a game between 2 very highly rated grandmasters, Mickey Adams versus Nielsen Peter. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. What do we see in this position? Well, first of all, let's count material. We see a pair of queens, a pair of rooks, a pair of knights, easy to evaluate so far, and we can also tell that while there is a pawn balance on the king side of the board, white has an extra pawn on the queen side. Also, if we look, we'll notice that the white queen immediately is attacking black's knight along with the rook. So therefore, that would be a potential threat to that knight. Even worse, white is threatening to capture the rook on d2 because of a pin. So for example, if black kind of makes a careless move, let's say attacking white's queen, then the best move is to just capture the rook on d2, because if not, then knight takes queen, rook takes queen, and white just won a rook. So the primary threat right now is the attack on the rook. And here black made a tricky move, capturing the pawn on a2, thinking that if right now rook captures knight, he'll even win the game. By checking, attacking the white king, white has a back rank problem, the king has no escape, the knight is pinned, and if the rook blocks the check, the rook captures back, and white will lose major material. Let's go back again to rook a2 and see what happens if the queen captures the knight. Well, that would be even worse, because the black queen would now capture the knight on f2 with a check, forcing white's king to the corner and then immediately checkmate. Wow! So, is rook a2 a good choice? Looks like it is. In fact, it's a tricky one. However, the problem now is that the black rook has been put onto an unprotected square, and white has a tricky but forceful way of putting the black king and rook in a fork. The first move is check, king h7, followed by queen b1. All of a sudden, it's a double attack, in other words, a fork, and black is losing. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position, which was played in the Continental Championship in Buenos Aires in 2005, it was white's turn. White certainly has a reasonable position. There is even material, but white is a bit behind in development. What do we mean by that? We mean that white hasn't castled yet and will need to spend 2 more moves to do so. Move the bishop out of the way first and then castle. And indeed, that's what white tried to do, but his choice of move was a mistake. Best was in this position to advance the c-pawn to make sure the a3 pawn will not be hanging. White instead moved the bishop to d3, which is a serious mistake. Not because black will capture the pawn, but things actually get worse. What's happening now is that the white queen gets into an awkward situation after e5. The queen is being attacked. Seemingly the queen now can capture the pawn. In fact, now the knight is hanging. The problem is that knight f6 again attacks the queen. and the queen has only one safe square where it will not be captured immediately, which is going back to f3, and now black can advance the e-pawn, creating a fork. Be always very careful when your queen is on the middle of the board and it is surrounded by a lot of pieces. Oftentimes, it will be in a danger of being trapped. Let's move on. In this position, black made a mistake. Instead of exchanging rooks, which would be the natural thing to do, black wanted to keep those pair of rooks on the board and move the bishop to d2. What's the problem with this move? The problem is that it puts the bishop in a pin. White simply moved rook to c2, attacking the bishop a second time, and now the bishop is getting in trouble. It cannot move away because the rook on d5 then would be hanging. On the other hand, if black protects the rook, white can simply chase that rook, and if the rook moves up, then black suffers from the back rank attack and the king has no escape. Or, after bishop b6, if black intends to counterattack that bishop, white can freely go for all these exchanges for the same problem. The back rank is not protected for black, and it's checkmate. And here comes our very final example in this lesson, where we'll see that doesn't matter how nice your position is or how good of a player you are, you always have to be careful and watch out for tactics. In this position, white made a careless move. Instead of moving his own rook to e4, for example, creating a pin over black's rook, white instead advanced the d-pawn, which looks like a good thing because the pawn is only 2 squares away from promotion right now. The problem is that black has a tricky way to win that pawn. Not right away, because then white could give a discovered check and win black's queen. But first give a check on h6, forcing the white king into the pin, and now rook takes pawn. Not only wins the pawn, but the rook as well on the following move. Well, you saw from all of these examples where in each one of them both players were rated 2400 or above. So they were pretty much an international master level player. And as you can see, even the best make mistakes time to time. So don't worry if you make mistake here and there, learn from it and don't repeat it next time. Well, good luck and hope to have you back next week. Bye-bye.